Well, this is a bit of a different video. With all my other favorite universes going in terrible directions, either in terms of storytelling or just the fan base, I decided now would be a good time to talk about one of my more recent obsessions, Deltarune. That and the fact that chapters 3 and 4 could release any day now, so now would be a good time to get in some last minute predictions for those chapters as well as what might come after. I might update this video once those chapters are out. Also, a lot of these ideas I present in this video aren't new. A lot of them are heavily inspired by other Deltarune theorists like Spooky Dude and Cammy Boy G, so shout out to those guys. With that being said, here are my predictions. Chapter 3 is definitely the easiest to predict, as it's the one we already have the most information about. In fact, the ending of Chapter 2 literally shows this chapter's Dark World being made, which means we know who all the Lighteners in this chapter will be. We see Chris, Susie, and Toriel all in the building when the Dark Fountain is being made, so they're all guaranteed. But also, Toriel calls the police, meaning that Undyne and or Napstablook could be showing up in this chapter. I lean towards both, because I think it would be fun to see them as partners. I imagine them filling the Birdly role this chapter as secondary characters who briefly serve as antagonists, while Toriel I could see actually joining our party. Maybe she could even have her own weird route, although I'm not so sure about that, since I do think Noelle will appear in basically every chapter after this. I think it could be cool, but it's also possible that this chapter just doesn't have a weird route. Let's talk about this chapter's bosses. We know that Tenna is one of them. Most people think he's a game show host, and I'll agree with that for right now. Most people believe Tenna will be the main villain, and I disagree with this due to chess theory, which is the theory that each chapter's main villain will be named after a chess piece in descending order of value. I believe this theory for several reasons, but that isn't really relevant, seeing as a good portion of the fanbase already believes this theory. But this would mean Chapter 6's main villain would be named Rook. One theory is that Rook is some higher-up executive type working behind Tenna's game show. And for the secret boss, I regret to inform you that I genuinely believe Woody theory. Look, call me crazy, but the evidence feels like too much to be a coincidence. Maybe not the rest of the specifics, but if nothing else, I definitely believe that Chapter 6 secret boss will be a character from a canceled cowboy show. It explains Toby Fox's weird wording, it ties in with the theme of being discarded, and Friend Inside Me can definitely be seen as foreshadowing. Oh, and this could also be Mike, but I don't know about that. Next is Chapter 4. Just to get it out of the way, I, like most others, believe that this chapter's Dark World will be in the church. Chapter 3 will take place the night after Chapter 2, which would place Chapter 4 the next day after Chapter 2. And when you know it, in Chapter 2, Rudy says he might be able to go to church tomorrow. Because of this, I believe this will be when Noelle returns, and this chapter will lead to her discovering that Dark Worlds are real. This also aligns with chess theory, since this chapter would be where we fight the bishop. But I don't think the bishop will just be a random Darkner. No, I actually think that the main villain of Chapter 4 will be none other than Father Alvin. I know, it feels like he should be the knight. On paper, he fits the knight perfectly. But the title of bishop suits him much more than knight, if you ask me. And this means that even if he isn't the knight, we don't have to throw out all the evidence of him being suspicious. I believe Alvin is working with the knight, and also will be the one to open this chapter's Dark World, just as Chris opened the Chapter 3 Dark World instead of the knight. I think it would be pretty odd if Chris was the only one, besides the knight, to open a Dark Fountain. And this explains what that line about him using Gerson's hammer to do something questionable is referencing. If he had used it to open the previous Dark Worlds, it seems odd that Gerson's grave seems so untouched, But if he hasn't dug it up yet, but he's going to do so, and he's going to use it to open that Chapter 4 Dark World, that makes a lot more sense. That way, we can have Alvin be a villain, as was set up, without having him be the knight. Obviously, Rudy will come with as well, and maybe even die in this chapter, although he seemed to be getting better the last time we saw him, so that part I doubt. I'm also going to throw out that Caddy and Jockington join us in this Dark World. Since they both have talk sprites indicating that they'll be important at some point, and this feels like a good point to do that before we start getting into the big plot chapters. Not that this chapter won't be plot relevant, seeing as this is supposed to be the chapter that gets us back on track story-wise. Not only do I think that Alvin will foreshadow the knight's identity, I also think that this will be the chapter where we learn more about Ralsei, his true origins and the reason for his special abilities, and potentially that he isn't actually the prince in the prophecy. When you really think about it, there's no real reason to think Ralsei is a prince besides what he himself says. Now, don't get me wrong, I am not saying Ralsei is evil. If anything, I prefer the idea that he was just lonely and presented himself as a prince to make himself feel like he had a greater purpose and potentially grow closer to Chris and Susie. But I do think this revelation will lead to us fighting Ralsei and ultimately him leaving the party. In the light world, it seems like we're going to visit the Holiday House in this chapter, and I'm going to predict that this is where we meet Mayor Holiday, given she's been teased before. Chapter 5 is definitely the hardest Dark World to pinpoint. It would be easy to say Flower King because of the double doors, but I'm actually going to go with Ice-E's Pizza. Why? Because Ice-E seems strangely prominent in this game. So, it would feel weird if he didn't have a Dark World in his own restaurant. Maybe I'm also biased here as a FNAF fan, and I do kind of think it would be funny if the entire Dark World was just one big FNAF reference. But I think that this is an incredibly likely Dark World location. We can obviously expect Burger Pants to join us alongside potentially the rest of the Ice-E staff, and it would honestly be kind of funny if he actually ended up joining our party. But I could see Azriel coming back this chapter, as this is when we enter the game's big plot chapters, and also because he is good friends with Burger Pants. I do think we will face Ice-E himself in this chapter, but not as the main villain. He'll be a fake-out villain, kind of like Lancer or Tenna. Because of chess theory, I fully expect this to be the chapter where we fight the knight. And now I need to address quite possibly the biggest mystery in the community at the moment. Who is the knight? I don't know. No, seriously, I don't know. There are a lot of compelling candidates, and I wouldn't be surprised if any of them end up being the knight. I'm just not sure. Originally, I thought it was Gaster, then I started thinking it was Des, and now there are a lot of other great candidates, like Azriel, Everyman, and even Chris. Just like Alvin, even if Chris isn't the knight, I still think we should be suspicious of them, and not so quick to trust them. However, for the sake of this video, I should probably assign an identity to the knight. So, if I had to pick who I think the knight is, I'd choose Mayor Holiday. I actually wasn't the biggest fan of this theory at first. In fact, I was originally going to put Everyman as my choice for the knight, but I changed my mind at the last minute. I still think Everyman is more important than most people think, maybe even as the final secret boss. And I still think Everyman is a solid choice for the knight, but I've been convinced over time that the mayor is probably the most likely to be the knight by a little bit. No, I can't lie, there's only a little bit of evidence for this. The big one is that the mayor is currently setting up the festival, and both of the Dark Worlds we've seen have had carnival rides in them. But I think it makes a lot of sense. The mayor would have access to all the buildings in town, and this would make her a parallel to Asgore in Undertale. As for her motivation, I think her searching for Des is the most interesting. Oh, also, you could argue that if this is true, it would make more sense for the festival to be this chapter's Dark World, but I have other plans for that. But first, we need to talk about Chapter 6. I think Chapter 6 is the bunker. The reason I place this here and not in Chapter 7 is because I believe Chapter 7 will take place entirely during the Roaring. In my opinion, that Dark World should be big and take up all of Hometown rather than a specific building. Besides, most of us can agree that the bunker is somehow connected to Gaster, and Gaster is heavily associated with the number 6. Aside from Gaster, the other person we'll find down in the bunker is Des. Unless she's the Knight. I think this seems obvious in my opinion. For the main villain of the chapter, I predict the Vessel. I think they could definitely be described as a pawn. I also predict we'll encounter the Gaster followers down here as well. Alternatively, I've also seen the idea that the soul could be transferred to the Vessel, and if that's the case, then Chris could actually be this chapter's main villain. Chapter 7. This is the big one, and probably the hardest to predict. What I can say is that this chapter will take place during the Roaring with the festival as the Dark World location. Or I should say main Dark World location, because as I said, I see this Dark World taking up all of Hometown, allowing us to explore Dark Worlds that didn't get their own chapters, particularly outside ones like the lake. There will be a lot of characters in this Dark World, but the most notable ones to join us here are Sans and Papyrus. We will fight the Titans in this chapter, but for the final boss, I predict the Angel. The reason I think that Gaster won't be the villain is because it seems at the end of the Gonermaker intro, Gaster is being cut off by a second voice. It is possible that the Angel is meant to represent another character, but if I dared say that I think Kara will be the main villain of Deltarune, I'd probably be torn to shreds. So I will simply be referring to this second voice as the Angel. I do see why people think Gaster is the main villain. It wouldn't surprise me. But I see him as more of a mostly neutral character who can be pushed to intervene if the situation is extreme enough. This is my prediction for Snowgrave. I mean, we already have a character who has filled that exact kind of role in the past with Sans. Granted, you could argue that's a problem, as Gaster would essentially just be Sans again, but there's probably a connection between the two anyways, so it works. Don't get me wrong, I do think Gaster will appear in the normal route, but maybe he only appears in Chapter 6, and only intervenes in Chapter 7 if we do Snowgrave. This is when we reconcile with Ralsei, and also find out who the real Prince from the Dark is. It's Lancer. So right off the bat, his father is a king, so he is technically more of a prince than Ralsei is as far as we know. Lancer is also very important in Chapter 1, but was kind of forgotten about after Chapter 2 came out. Despite this, I feel like he's more important than we think. Oh, and before you bring up the fact that Darkeners will all turn to stone during the Roaring, the exact dialogue is that they will slowly turn to stone one by one, so Lancer should have time to go with them. And it could be part of this chapter's plot that they need to reach the Angel's heaven before he turns to stone. Oh, and you may have noticed who causes this Dark World? That's because I actually have no idea. This is the one blind spot in this theory. My candidates are Chris, the Vessel, and Father Alvin, but that is just speculation. And the ending is kinda impossible for me to guess because it came from a fever dream that Toby Fox had, so yeah, this is it for now. Obviously, I'm not expecting all of this to be correct. I'm pretty confident in my predictions for Chapter 3 and even Chapter 4, but the rest is basically just speculation. Chances are I'll get some things wrong and some things right. I still have no idea how Everyman or Miss Boom would fit into all this, so yeah, we're missing some pieces. We only have 2 chapters of 7.